Hi, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Hannah Daly. I am a third year student in the Master's in Counseling program here at DePaul University. I decided to do a presentation on grief and loss after I realized that, a lot of us are experiencing confusing feelings given what's going on right now with the COVID pandemic. And I thought it would be really helpful for me to kind of understand for myself and be able to help educate those around me on what's going on for us. So my hope is today that you will learn a little bit more about grief and loss and some ways to cope to help you and the people around you that you care about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Throughout this presentation, I have a couple questions that I'm hoping you all wouldn't mind answering, giving me a little bit more information. This is really just to kind of understand who is, tuning into this resource, who's finding it useful, whether or not it is useful, and information for me as well to kind of continue to tweak this and make sure that it's really helping people. And so for those questions, I'm going to be using PollEverywhere. And so if you're able to, you can do that by joining it via a new web browser or doing it by text. The information is listed here for how to log in on either one of those. All of the responses that you provide are going to be completely anonymous. So go ahead and put in whatever screen name you feel comfortable sharing as long as it's appropriate. It doesn't need to have anything identifying. These questions are really just so I can get an understanding of who's watching this presentation and to just know who this is connecting with. And so for the first question, if you wouldn't mind sharing just what year you are at DePaul, and if this doesn't apply to you, please just go ahead and respond with other. And then for the next question, what college are you in at DePaul? I know that some of you might be in more than one college or taking classes in another, so please just go ahead and choose whatever feels like it's the most fitting for you. And also, please feel free to pause this as you're watching this if you need a little bit more time to figure out how to use PollEverywhere and read through all of the different options. Okay, and then really to get started on this topic of grief and loss, I want to share a quick little video that I think kind of gets us ready to start thinking and talking about this.
As COVID-19 spreads, millions have witnessed life change literally overnight.
I think on many levels, there's such a sense of loss during this pandemic.
Dr. Patrice Harris, a psychiatrist and the president of the American Medical Association, says if we don't pause and feel that loss, we won't give ourselves what we need to start to make sense of what's happening in the world. Grief. Grief is the bone-deep sorrow that fills the space left by absence. The virus is erasing the routines, jobs, and habits that once shaped our days and gave us our sense of who we are.
The loss of rituals and transitions, and unfortunately for some folks in this country, the loss of loved ones. People are losing their jobs, unfortunately. Priority is to make sure we stop the spread of this pandemic, because it is this pandemic that is the reason for loss of jobs and loss of tradition, loss of those rituals.
Those rituals help us feel a sense of control in a time that feels so completely out of control. Even the traditions that allowed the grieving to physically come together can't happen right now.
I think those rituals are important to give us a sense of order, give us a sense of saying goodbye, particularly for funerals. I think, again, a sense of stability. Now, loss and grief and losing loved ones, it never ever goes away. But what we do is manage to, I guess, integrate the loss of whatever our feelings into our next phase and incorporate that and hopefully move on.
While so many are keeping their distance from each other, moving through grief seems unimaginable.
We each have to recognize how we grieve, respect how we grieve, and allow ourselves, give ourselves permission to grieve in the way that gets us through to the next phase, which is remembering, appreciating what we had, and then deciding what we can do each individually to move forward in the next phase.
In some cities and towns, people are finding a way through, at least in part, by singing and cheering together.
Okay, so as we move forward, I think that there's a couple terms that are really helpful to kind of just ground ourselves in and really remind ourselves what their definition is as we continue to kind of talk through grief and loss in the context of COVID-19. And so loss is a state of being without, and this is something that applies to really anything in your life. So this can be whether it's the loss of an event, the loss of a person, the loss of some object that was really important to you. And then mourning is the expression of sorrow in response to a loss. And this is something that is usually more of an outward expression. So this is typically what people experience when they go to something like a funeral or a memorial. That kind of outward expression of sorrow is really an important part of the grieving process. And that's specifically considered to be mourning. And then grief is the emotional reaction to any form of loss. So we can lose something, but it doesn't necessarily, depending on what its importance was to us, we aren't necessarily going to experience grief over it, but grief is something that we experience as an emotional response to something that's important to us that we lost. And then bereavement is a type of grief involving the loss of a loved one specifically. So this is more reserved for if you're losing, human life. And, given the situation that we're currently in, grief is really going to be experienced and felt by all of us. We are losing a lot of human life, and that's awful and very tragic. But it is something that even if those of us who are fortunate enough to not experience losing someone close to us or knowing someone, friends and family who have lost someone, it is not just reserved for human life. And, us losing connection with others, our support system, losing our jobs, those are all different important losses that will likely bring up grief for people. And even for those of us who might be very, very fortunate in this pandemic and we don't lose anything that is particularly important to us, including, our job or connection or even, someone close to us, because everyone around us is going to be losing so much and we even are losing this sense of normalcy, there is going to be this collective grief felt by all of us. And it's going to be inescapable for even those of us who come out of this more fortunate than others. And this is obviously a non-exhaustive list, but this just shows, some of the common losses that people might be experiencing as a result of COVID-19. As I mentioned, there's human life, which is, a really, really tragic loss. But for some people, they may experience financial loss, and that might really cause a disruption in their life. And these are very personal to the people that are experiencing them and what's important in their lives and what they need to kind of feel safe and normal. And so just something to kind of think about for yourself, what things you may have already lost or what things that you anticipate you're going to be losing. And then, when we talk about the loss of life specifically, and this is something that is going to be complicated with COVID-19. People are dying alone. People are not able to be with their loved ones in those final moments, even if they're not necessarily suffering from COVID-19, but because of the different healthcare restrictions and things that are put in place, people are unable to be with their loved ones in those final moments. And there's also the inability to hold a funeral or other religious and memorial services that we really associate with the loss of life. And, those are not necessarily enjoyable events by any means in general, but they are important for us to be able to kind of mark that ending of that life and be able to have that mourning, that outward expression, and also that sense of community to be able to kind of have those other people around you supporting you. Um, and just a quote that I thought was useful to kind of think about for this is that grief is not a mental health issue, but if it's not addressed, it can become one. And so this is something that I think will be important for us to keep in mind in the coming months and years, even after this, that, grief is a natural part of life, but given a lot of the complexities and complications that go along with it because of our current situation, it might become a little bit more difficult for some people to move through. And so, when talking about mourning the loss of life during COVID-19, since I mentioned how it's really difficult and almost impossible in a lot of ways now to have those formal, traditional funerals or memorial services in the way that we all know, all of the research points to the importance of marking the death when it happens. In a lot of ways, it may feel like we would much prefer to wait to experience that sense of mourning and that funeral or that memorial with other people when we're able to be back together in person. But actually, it's really important for us to mark the finality of something, and especially with the human life, because grieving does not stop just because we have not given it attention or just because we have said, okay, it's not the right time. It's going to affect us no matter what. And so the most useful way for us to kind of approach it is to acknowledge it, and that way we can actually start processing and moving through it in a way that allows us to continue living our lives as best as we can right now. And so even if services are delayed, thinking through something you can do, it can be very personalized to you and the people that are close to you, of having maybe a Zoom type of memorial service or a little table where you put out some things to have kind of a little memorial service. Anything that feels authentic and useful for you to kind of remember the life of someone, and to know that those can be really helpful as we kind of have to start working through some of this grief. And a lot of funeral homes actually have resources for things to be put online that were already around before the pandemic even started. So things like obituaries and guest books and video tributes, they have a lot of those capabilities already to have those be placed online, and that to be something that people all around the world can access and foster that sense of community with your loved ones right now, knowing that we are unable to kind of spend that time together. And so in the absence of that, finding different ways to mark the death when it happens and be able to kind of have that sense of community and mourning with other people with whom that person was important, is really going to be useful for us, as opposed to delaying it. And that's not to say that you can't do things when we are able to spend time with each other, but really just to maybe think about doing both, because it's important for us to kind of mark the death when it happens. And when we're talking about grief, there's a lot of different types of grief, but some of the most common types, and the ones that I think are really important for us to think about when thinking about our current situation, is normal grief, anticipatory grief, and complicated grief. Normal grief is not meant to imply that it is easier. But as I mentioned, grief is an inevitable part of life. And so we are going to lose things at some point or another in our life. We just are experiencing a lot of it right now. And so normal grief defines the process of moving through that grieving process after the loss of something significant and getting to the place of acceptance. This doesn't mean that you're no longer affected by the loss, or you're no longer thinking about either the person or the event or anything that you lost. It just means that we have accepted it and we're able to kind of go back to re-engaging in our life in a way that was similar to how we were beforehand, or at least we are feeling like we're able to kind of live out our life in a way that we want to. And so when talking about anticipatory grief, this is really, I think, the thing that people are experiencing the most right now. This happens before the actual loss occurs. So this is something that usually applies to when someone is diagnosed with a terminal illness. So that person, unfortunately, is going to pass away, within a certain time frame, but that person is still around, and that can make that process really difficult because you start mourning and grieving the loss of that person before they are officially no longer with us. And so this does not apply just to human life. This applies to any kind of loss in general, because as I mentioned, grief applies to the emotional response to any loss. And so this is really what a lot of people are experiencing right now because of the ambiguity and uncertainty of what we're experiencing. There's a lot of things we know we've already lost, but then there's a lot of things that we are anticipating that we might be losing, and we're not even sure what we might be losing yet. And so that can be a really difficult place to be, because that grieving process does not necessarily have, grief in general doesn't have structure, but even less so when it's anticipatory grief. And complicated grief is the type of grief that occurs when someone is struggling to process their grief effectively. So this happens when someone is, there is no time frame on grief, but this happens when someone is really struggling to get to the place of acceptance, and their normal daily life is being impacted by it. And this typically happens when people are unable to move through the grieving process. And so this is something that I think will be important for us to be aware of in the coming months and years, because a lot of us are experiencing grief, but in such a complicated way right now that moving through that process might be really difficult for folks. And, we are all experiencing loss on a lot of different scales. We are losing things on a personal level. Again, a non-exhaustive list there. I'm sure you can fill in so many other things that might be affecting you personally. And so those are really difficult to process. But then on, a higher level or a macro scale, there's all of these things that we are experiencing that are really even more so outside of our control. They involve like the healthcare system being overworked right now. The fact that a lot of people have lost their jobs, and unemployment is something that's being affected, but we're really needing to rely on. There's all of these other losses that we're experiencing on an even bigger level than just in our individual life. And those really compound onto one another, and they can make the feelings of smaller things in our life seem even bigger, because we really have a lot of weight of a lot of different things on our shoulders right now. And a lot of you are probably already familiar with this. These are the stages of grief. These have been around for a long time, and there are 5 of them that are the most common, that people kind of are most familiar with too. And it's denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and acceptance. And I think that it's really important when talking about the stages of grief to remind ourselves and others that these are not meant to be linear. That is something that a lot of people sometimes get confused by, and it also can be really difficult and hurtful towards their progress, towards acceptance. We're ultimately working towards acceptance, but that's not to say that you go from denial to anger to bargaining to sadness to acceptance, and if you don't, that you're not properly moving through your grief. These are something that people can experience all with even one day. There is no time frame on how people grieve. There is no time frame that means you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. These are just common feelings and experiences that people have when they're grieving the loss of something. And so it can be helpful for you to kind of know it so that you can be aware of what's going on for you, but really try not to put pressure on yourself of moving through or what you should be experiencing. And I think this little graphic here shows a good example of what it really is like when you lose someone or something important to you and you're experiencing that grief. It can be all over the place, even within, a couple hours of your day. And even these little quotes here, I think, if you're just thinking through like what the stages of grief mean, these are about COVID-19 happening in general, and they can just be really helpful for you to kind of frame what that looks like. And it might even be something that some of you have related to as well. And then when we talk about symptoms of grief, there's a lot of different things that pop up for people. And again, similar to a lot of these things, and I'm saying this because I think it really illustrates that grief is such a unique and personalized experience, and it looks so different for every person. And so again, similar to what I said before, also non-exhaustive lists of what people experience, but just some common ones that people may be experiencing when they're experiencing grief. And, sometimes you're aware that I'm experiencing this because I'm experiencing grief. And sometimes you're wondering, why can I not sleep at night? I know sleeping has been something that a lot of people have been commenting has been difficult since the start of the pandemic. And so just kind of checking in with yourself and being aware or noting whether or not you're experiencing feelings that you have not experienced before or are coming up for you, more recently. And so these are just some of the physical and emotional symptoms that are commonly associated with grief. And then there's also some behavioral and cognitive symptoms as well. And again, you can have one of these and it still means you're grieving. You can have all of these or none of these. It really is such a personal experience, but it's just about knowing what is different from how I normally live my life or my normal level of functioning, because it's really important for us to kind of be aware of what's going on for us in order to be able to work through it. And so I'm going to ask another question as we kind of have talked a little bit about grief and loss, in the context of the pandemic. If you wouldn't mind sharing one loss that you've experienced as a result of this. And so this is, a short answer, short sentence, or just a word even, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. And again, feel free to go ahead and pause this if you need another moment to be able to write something out and share it. Okay, so now moving into coping with grief and what that process looks like. So the first and most important step in the grieving process to getting to that point of acceptance is to name it. And when I say name it, I mean being able to say to ourselves, okay, the reason why I'm having trouble sleeping, the reason why I've been really irritable lately, the reason why I've been picking fights with, who I'm living with, is because I think I'm really upset that I no longer am able to take my classes in person. And so being able to really be honest with ourselves about the fact that we are experiencing this grief and what the things are that are the losses that we're experiencing, to really acknowledge the significance that they had in our life and how difficult it is now to not have them and to not have things play out in the way that we expected and desired. And so being able to name that for ourselves really is helpful, and it will start that grieving process. And I think it's important to note that grieving cannot be bypassed. It is not something that you can kind of say to yourself, I'm going to just avoid this and deny this, but in 2 months time, I'll be over it. And then I'll be ready to kind of move on with my life. If we have lost something significant to us, we are going to experience grief whether or not we decide to name it. It's just going to make that process easier for us and we're going to move through it in a quicker way if we are able to acknowledge what's going on for us. And so, acknowledging it is a really good first step, naming and claiming it. And then also trying to give ourselves space to really think about the specific things that are associated with that loss, whether it's even listing out what are the losses that I'm experiencing that are really difficult right now. And then what are the feelings that I'm associating with this? Again, even looking back at the symptoms list, what are some of the things that are coming up for me that I don't normally experience that are happening now and are probably associated with this loss that I'm struggling with. Journaling can be a great way to kind of process this. Talking with others can be really useful, but sometimes we don't know how we're even feeling ourselves. So, journaling or finding a different way, whatever works for you, to sit with those feelings and be able to think through what's going on for you. And something also important to keep in mind is that just because we give attention to a feeling does not mean it's going to overtake us. So just because we say, all right, I'm going to acknowledge it, I'm really struggling with this loss, does not mean that we will be unable to function and be caught up in this feeling of sadness and be drowned out by it. It actually works the opposite way. The fact that we are able to name it and acknowledge it will actually start that process of grieving, and it will help us be more aware of what's going on for us so that we don't get to that place of complicated grief, because again, we can't just skip over the process of grief. And so avoidance may seem like a really good option right now because it just may seem like this is not a useful time to be addressing the feelings that we're having, but it actually will do us a disservice if we are not acknowledging this for ourselves. And just something that I think can be useful when speaking with someone else, especially a child or adolescent, but even just anyone who we care about. It's really important to not jump to the point of a silver lining in them. So that means when someone says that they're really upset about their graduation and we say to them, well, at least you're graduating. Yes, that's definitely a positive, but now might not be the right time to be talking about things like that. The biggest thing about grief is just feeling like someone has bared witness and acknowledge our grief can actually be really healing in and of itself. People don't need things to be fixed, and a lot of the times we can't fix it. So just acknowledging and being there for someone is the best that we can do. And just overall reminding ourselves that grief is natural and useful. It is a really unfortunate part of life, but it is inevitable. We experience grief when we've lost something that is important to us. So actually, in a lot of ways, when we reflect back on what we're bothered by or what we're grieving, it tells us a lot about ourselves, and it tells us a lot about what's important to us. And that may be a difficult place to kind of get to right now or think about it in that way. But just try and remember that you are grieving something because you lost something important to you, and that is information about yourself, and that eventually will be useful for you as you move forward. And it's hard to imagine it now, but we really will be able to get to a place where we can go back to functioning in the way that we had before, and these feelings will lessen. Another thing to keep in mind when coping with grief is the idea of staying in the present. Um, Mindfulness has a lot of benefits: reduction in rumination, stress reduction, boost working memory. All of these things are helpful when we also are talking about grief. It really is helpful because of the ambiguity of this current situation. So there's a lot of different mindfulness exercises, meditation, engaging in the five senses. It does not have to be this big, like I'm sitting down and doing yoga. It's really just finding ways to engage yourself, engage your senses, stay in the present, and really just not pass judgment on our thoughts. So there's a lot of different outlets and resources if you're looking to kind of learn more about that or find different ways to engage in mindfulness. And also using the both and framework can be helpful. A lot of the times we have these moments of happiness or moments of enjoyment and content with this current situations, but may feel this sense of guilt. And so being able to allow ourselves to feel both is really important. So you can feel this loss and be bummed out by the loss that you're experiencing. And you can also be kind of happy about the fact that you're able to watch this movie that you wouldn't have been able to watch if you had to be at work. So being able to allow yourself to feel both, and know that you do not have to constantly be in the process of grieving. Just because you're allowing yourself to name it and feel it does not mean that you have to constantly be in mourning, because we are in a situation with a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. And without that end point, it actually is not super productive and helpful for us to constantly be dwelling on things. So don't feel guilty to engage in things to be able to draw your attention away from the feelings of guilt, and to be able to find positive things in the present moment. And then also expressing gratitude. This is something that might not feel right for everyone right now. But if you are able to think about some of the things that you're grateful for, there's also evidence that that can really help our mindsets as well. And this can even be something like in the video, how, there's these like expressions of gratitude for our healthcare workers. It can be something on a bigger scale. But if you're able to find things that you are grateful for in despite of this situation, that can be really helpful for helping that mindset for you and to continue to work through that grief. Also, there was a study that talked about how individuals who moved through grief more quickly, the thing that they all had in common was engaging in a ritual. And I think this is really useful and interesting to think about, because we are not able to engage in the rituals that we commonly would engage in before on a bigger level, like funerals and memorials. But we can actually create very personalized and private rituals for ourselves. And as long as they have meaning for us, they can actually provide us with a sense of control, which is really useful when we're in a situation where we don't feel like we have a lot of control. And so this could be something that might be helpful to think about as well, of engaging in something that has meaning to you and no one else has to know about, but it's a way that you're able to kind of acknowledge your feelings, the situation, and you feel like you're in control because it's something you've created. And then also utilizing support systems and communities. Even though we can't meet in person right now, that doesn't mean that these resources don't still exist. And so whether it's Zoom, social media, connecting with people on blogs or forums, there are different ways to still get in contact with people and foster that sense of community. There's even a free online Facebook grief group that meets daily. And so religious services are being streamed online, and also a lot of organizations that are completely unrelated to grief and loss, but we may have found community in before, are going virtual. And it's okay to kind of rely on those or lean on those, even if it's unrelated to grief and loss, to just have that sense of community and be able to connect with others. And lastly, engaging in creativity. I won't go into too much detail on this. I think we all understand what creativity means, and that has, a different definition for each of us. But this is just, it's in a way something that we can do to kind of even have that mourning for ourselves in the absence of being able to meet with people and have that in a funeral or memorial. And it can also help us process and clarify our feelings associated with our different losses. So this is something that can look so different for every person, but it's also something that has been shown to be really helpful with people as they move through the grieving process. And then just lastly, some self-care tips in general that are helpful, for a lot of the feelings associated with this situation, but can also be useful for grief and loss as well. And so, it depends on what kind of you feel connected to. There's a lot of different things listed here. A lot of them are basically just about kind of forming routines and removing yourself from triggering websites, remembering the importance of even just basic things like drinking enough water, getting sleep and movement, and also knowing that you can engage in healthy distractions. You could do things that have no point other than just enjoyment. You don't have to constantly be in this state of grief and loss. It's just important to acknowledge that's what you're experiencing, because then you can go on and move into some of those other things. And it's not avoidance. It's you just taking care of yourself as opposed to using it as a way to distract yourself from what's really going on. And I think just to really sum all of this up, something that I think I've talked about a lot, mentioned throughout, but just really remember that everyone grieves differently. So try not to judge yourself and others for how they are processing their losses, or what losses are important to them, or, whether or not they're responding in the same way that you are. Just try and remember that we are all going through a difficult time right now, and grief shows up differently for everyone anyways, but especially when we are in a situation like this that is so unprecedented. So just try and show yourself and others some compassion as we work through this. And then just hoping to get a little bit of an understanding on, I'll move this over here, of the skills and ideas that you learned about in this presentation, which ones you could see yourself trying over the next week. For this one, you can choose as many as apply for you. So you can just check more than one of the letters if you find that more than one applied or seemed interesting to you. Again, go ahead and feel free to pause this if it would be easier for you to spend a little bit more time on it. And then lastly, as I mentioned, I really want to understand what parts of this connected with people, but also what parts of it still feel like there's questions surrounding it. So if you have any questions, if you don't, no problem at all. But if you had any questions about grief or loss that you feel like weren't covered in this, or were actually brought up by, what we talked about today, please go ahead and shoot that through as well. And hopefully we can get to a place where we're getting people all of the resources that they need. So I will go ahead and end it there. Thank you all for checking out this video. I hope that you find it helpful, and I hope that you are doing what you can to take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you again for tuning in.